Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at soil degradation. Which of the following do you think is the biggest cause of soil degradation worldwide? A. Deforestation, B. Industrial pollution, C. Damaging farming methods, or D. Overgrazing. So go ahead and hit pause and decide. Okay, welcome back. If you said overgrazing, that is the correct answer. And we also see some of the other choices here. We have cropland agriculture, so this would be farming methods, deforestation, and industrial pollution would be coming from the industrialization right there, that little sliver. So that's a pretty small one. But we do have some pollutants contaminating our soil. But mostly it's a problem with livestock overgrazing, deforestation, especially on slopes where flowing water can carry away soil, and cropland agriculture where you have too much plowing and too much monoculture. So let's take a look here at arable land per capita. It is decreasing, and by per capita, remember that means per person. This one here is in units of hectares per 1,000 people. So we see three colors here: blue for 1975, and then it goes in 10-year increments, 85, 95, and 05. So we can see that in Australia, they have actually increased their arable land during that decade, but in all other countries they saw a decrease in arable land, and that word arable means farmable. So this is extremely significant because we have an increasing world population but less farmable land. So we have to deal with how do we keep our land fertile. So one thing is to minimize erosion, which is the movement of soil from one area to another. And we can see that happening in this little gully. We can see a way of measuring it by using a stick and seeing how much the ground goes down. So here's a map showing erosion, areas where erosion is exceeding the soil loss tolerance rate on cropland in 2007. So what we mean by that is this would be the amount of soil you can use annually and still have your soil be sustainable over the long run, because at the same time that you're losing soil, soil can also regenerate itself, but at a slow rate. So all these areas in red are warning signs, and we see that 20%, 28% of U.S. farmland has lost soil at an unsustainable rate in 2007, and it was 40% in 1982. So we have gotten better at slowing our rate of soil loss. And talking about that rate there, going back to this here, we can see that the rate of loss for the U.S. has been, well, actually it's not really showing in this graph. I was going to say that, Russia, their rate of soil loss decreased. It didn't go down as much from decade to decade. Okay, let's come back to here. So you should try this problem. It's on page 275 in your textbook, number 1. And this is just some practice with absolute change. And the topic is percent soil loss. Okay, so what's the deal with soil? How do we lose it? How do we gain it? And we saw this image before. We have a flat floodplain surrounding a main river channel. So here's a nice wide and deep channel, but every 10 or 100 years this is going to overflow its banks. And as it does, it's going to leave behind sediment that it's carrying. As it overflows its banks, it tends to slow down, and that means the sediment that it's carrying falls or settles onto the land. And that brings in soil with new nutrients. And so a definition for erosion, we've seen that already. A definition for deposition is the arrival of eroded material at a new location. And these processes are natural and can build up fertile soil, such as on the floodplains of rivers. And what's not natural is when we dam these rivers, so they no longer bring that sediment to the farm fields during flooding, because dams primarily, one of their primary goals is to help reduce flooding so that you don't have the property damage associated with it. Okay, so which of the following do you think is the biggest cause of soil erosion worldwide? Water, wind, or industrial pollution? And so here we're talking about erosion. The first question that we started off was just talking about degradation. And so we see here that water erosion is the top one, followed by wind. And soil structure problems, that means the glue network of fungi and organic matter that they're missing, making the problems of wind and water more severe. There are two types of soil erosion by water. You don't need to know these names, but you should recognize that they are all more likely when slopes are steeper. So you see splash erosion, and rill erosion, gully erosion, and sheet erosion. And soil erosion is a global problem. It's coupled with rapid population growth, and these two forces spell crisis for the future of agriculture. Humans are the primary cause of erosion. We are over 10 times more influential at moving soil than all other natural processes combined. And in the US, 1 inch of topsoil is lost every 15 to 30 years. And it can take 10 times longer than that to build up 1 inch of good topsoil. So here's one way we can measure soil. I'm not going to test you on this, and it's similar to what we saw in that earlier graph. You basically have a gauge, and as the erosion exceeds deposition, you'll start to get a gap between where the gauge is and where the current soil level is. One of the most notable examples of soil erosion is the Dust Bowl, and this was caused by drought coupled with degraded farmland in the 1930s. Where storms brought dust from the U.S. Great Plains all the way to New York and Washington and wrecked many lives. So one big problem was the way that they were cultivating the land. They were doing a lot of pretty intense plowing, and they were breaking up that soil structure. So you have fungi and you have other organic matter in the soil, but when they were doing too much plowing, it was causing those fungi and the organic matter to decompose, and so you didn't have that holding the soil together. So then you had a drought come along, and the soil got extremely dry, and you didn't have that network of organic matter holding it together. And so basically with the winds, it just blew away. So that prompted the Soil Conservation Act of 1935, and it provided money to educate farmers how to plow their lands without damaging them. And also gave money to plant trees and native grasses to reduce erosion. So this term of losing soil fertility is called desertification, and you can define it as a loss of more than 10% productivity due to a whole list of possibilities. You could have erosion, soil compaction, meaning it's just getting pressed down too much, so a lot of the biotic factors die off. You can have forest removal, overgrazing, drought, salinization, climate change, and depletion of water resources, and others as well. And we're going to take a look at some of these in the continuing slides. So erosion control. One way that you can prevent erosion control is by doing what's called contour farming, or intercropping, terracing, and conservation tillage. So here's a diagram showing, or a picture showing contour farming, where you're planting along the contour lines of slopes to reduce erosion on hillsides. So rather than making the lines going downhill, which would allow water to gain speed as it flows, it goes along the same contour, meaning that this water in this groove right here is going to be going along a flat surface. And it can't easily go from one contour to the next because that's not the way that the lines are laid in the soil. So here's terracing, where you're cutting stair steps or terraces, and this is the only way to farm extremely steep hillsides without causing massive erosion. It's labor intensive to create, but it's been a mainstay for centuries in the Himalayas and in the Andes. And this picture happens to be in the Andes. So the idea is that each one of these terraces is flat on its surface. And then we have intercropping, which is a mixing crops such as in-strip cropping to provide nutrients and reduce erosion. It can also reduce pests and disease. We saw this at Fairview Gardens, and it also reduces the flow of water through the field, so reducing erosion. And cover crops are grown between crop rows or between seasons to protect the soil from harsh winds and eroding or compacting rains. Kind of like that the picture that we saw earlier of the splash erosion, it can help reduce that. And here we see rye and crimson clover, which are grown between large collared crop plants. We can also use shelterbelts, which are rows of fast-growing trees around crop plantings to provide windbreaks, reducing erosion by wind. And you can see these if you drive along the 126 going towards Fillmore. And conservation tillage, this is leaving old crop residue on the ground instead of plowing it into the soil. And this covers the soil, keeping it in place. So you have examples of no-till and reduced tillage farming. And here, corn grows up out of a cover crop that was left there to die and decompose. So this is important because it can provide increased crop yields, less erosion, and healthier soils, and it also costs less because you're not spending the money on the fuel to operate the tractor. However, it is not a panacea for all crops everywhere because it often requires more chemical herbicides because weeds are not plowed under, which kills them, and it often requires more fertilizer because other plants compete with crops for nutrients. But legume cover crops can keep weeds at bay while nourishing the soil, and green manures can be used as organic fertilizers, keeping it natural. And we'll learn more about legume cover crops and how they can increase the nitrogen levels in soil. So here's a list of some benefits of no-till farming, and you should know at least two of them. And some key things are it does conserve biodiversity in the soil. It provides habitat for organisms, so it provides shelter and winter food for animals. And a big one is it reduces irrigation demands because now you have something covering the soil so you don't get evaporation as easily. And reduces fossil fuel use, we mentioned about that. And so by using less water, it also increases drought resistance of the soil. And big thing, it reduces erosion by 90%. That's huge. And here's a list of some benefits from the reduction in erosion. Let's take a look at some of these. It reduces silt deposition in reservoirs. So a reservoir would be that body of water behind the dam. When the creek or river water is coming into the reservoir, it stops at the dam, and therefore it releases or drops the sediment that it was carrying, and we call that silt. And it can build up a reservoir, filling it up from the bottom to reduce the capacity of the reservoir. And that's now silt that's not making its way downstream to help replenish soil in other areas. And it also, having less erosion means you have less dirt or less particulates in the water as it's flowing. And that can actually reduce water pollution from chemicals because many chemicals put into the water will attach themselves to these dirt particles. And so some other big ones here, it can reduce the cost of maintaining dirt roads by having less erosion. It can lower the cost of treating drinking water because you don't have to do as much filtering of the water to get rid of the sediment. And keep in mind, we get water from Lake Kachuma, so it has to go through a treatment process like that. Okay, let's turn to overcultivation. This is where you are trying to grow crops on land too intensely, and eventually the land's going to give out. It's not going to have the nutrients that it needs. So you can prevent this by doing crop rotation, which is alternating the crop planted. For example, corn one season, soybeans the next. This can restore nutrients to the soil and also fight pests and disease. Because you might be a pest that likes corn, but then the next year you don't have any corn, you have soybean instead. So now your population is going to dwindle because you don't have your food source. You can also do intercropping, which is mixing crops such as, like we saw in the picture earlier. This can also help reduce overcultivation because these different crops use different levels of nutrients. And some of these crops, if they're legumes, which are like bean plants, they can help to restore nitrogen levels to the soil. So let's talk about this concept of limiting nutrient. When a soil becomes depleted of needed nutrients, at some point you're going to get to where one of the nutrients becomes limiting for how quickly the plants or crops can grow. So a definition of limiting nutrient is it's the one nutrient of all the ones that a plant needs that is lowest in relation to how much the plant needs. Therefore, it is the one limiting the plant's growth. And this concept also applies to algae or any organism for that matter. So for example, if the limiting nutrient in the soil is, say, phosphorus, you can add as much nitrogen to the soil as you want, and you will not increase crop yields, not even a little bit. If you add more and more phosphorus, then yields will increase until you reach a point at which some other nutrient becomes the limiting nutrient. So one analogy for this is called the Liebig's barrel. Just as the capacity of a barrel with staves or these little boards, of unequal length is limited by the shortest stave, so a plant's growth is limited by the nutrient in shortest supply. So you can make these other staves as long as you want, but because this one's short, the water will never be able to go above that. So similarly, if you think about these each representing an essential element or nutrient that plants need, whatever one is lowest in relation to the plant's needs, that's going to be the one that limits the growth of the plant. So here we see nitrogen being a limiting nutrient. If you were to add nitrogen to the soil using synthetic fertilizer, it could rise up to the point where it is now above potassium. Now potassium will be, phosphorus, P. Now phosphorus will be your limiting nutrient. So it's whichever one is the least. Okay, now let's talk about over-fertilizing, which is also something that can degrade soil. Fertilizers supply nutrients to crops, and particularly they provide phosphorus and nitrogen. And inorganic fertilizers are mined or synthetically manufactured mineral supplements. They're often synthesized from fossil fuels. Organic fertilizers, on the other hand, include animal manure, crop residues, compost, etc. And organic fertilizers are better because they improve soil structure, nutrient retention, and water retention. So they have more of those biotic factors that can help keep the soil intact through the through the fungi, roots, and things like that. And also because they are high in decomposable organic matter, they tend to hold nutrients or keep nutrients in the soil. And they're kind of spongy, a lot of manure and things like that, so they help hold water. So check out this graph. This shows nitrogen inputs from fertilizer, and which color is fertilizer here? We have yellow, green, and red. So red is the fertilizer. And since 1950, we've seen the use of fertilizers increase several times, up to 7 times what it used to be. And so what's the best answer choice here? Go ahead and pause and choose your best choice. Okay, so if you said that the answer became the primary nitrogen source in the 1960s, that is correct. And so before that time, we mostly relied on animal manure to add nitrogen to soil. And legumes and pasture, again, this would be legumes would be bean plants that are planted because they have the ability to add nitrogen to the soil. And we'll learn how that works in our next unit. But synthetic fertilizers, huge increase. And here's another example that we see. We are now seeing that in different rivers in this country, we have much heightened levels of nitrates. And so comparing around 1900 to the end of the 1900s, we have sometimes almost 4 times increase in the nitrogen levels. So big deal. Well, what can happen from that is called eutrophication. And this means excess nutrient enrichment in the water, which increases production of organic matter. And by that, production of organic matter, we should be thinking algae. And those algae then decompose by oxygen using microbes, which can deplete water of oxygen, making a situation we call hypoxia. So eutrophication is too much of a good thing. And here's another depiction of it. So we have river water coming into the Gulf of Mexico, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in class and in relation to our next unit. You get a huge input of nitrogen. That makes phytoplankton flourish at the surface. Remember, these are the ones that do photosynthesis. So they're kind of like plants, and they use nitrogen as an essential nutrient. And when they get a lot of it, they grow like crazy. But the problem is they grow so fast, and eventually they're going to die. And when they die, they are not being decomposed by microorganisms on the bottom. And those microorganisms, just like us, they are consumers. And so they are going to use up oxygen to consume the dead algae. And so now you have a drop in oxygen, and that's going to kill fish and shrimp. And so on top here, you get warmer, less dense freshwater layer, which is oxygenated. But down lower, you get colder, denser ocean water, which is hypoxic, and that's where you're getting your dead fish occurring. Oh, we've seen this one already. So here are some examples of fertilizer runoff. We can see that fertilizers, inorganic, being applied to this field here, and then we have these fertilizers infiltrating into the ground, kind of like what we saw with our soil lab, water infiltrating into soil, and that can contaminate groundwater. It can also run off into local waterways, causing this phenomenon of eutrophication, and it can also evaporate, which introduces nitrogen into the atmosphere. And some of that can be contributors to smog and acid rain. So let's talk a little bit about overgrazing and deforestation. Overgrazing is when livestock eat too much plant cover on rangeland, impeding plant regrowth. And this is the case of a grazing species exceeding its carrying capacity, because it will have out-eaten its food source. And here we see the contrast between ungrazed field on the left and overgrazed land on the right. And on either side of the fence line, the difference can be striking. If you notice less grass and more weeds on the right. Here we see native grasses. Here we see fewer of those grasses, but more of these weeds that have come up. And these weeds are not something that livestock would be able to eat. So this creates a problem, and we'll talk about feedback loops in our next unit. But overgrazing here has the effect of removing native grasses, which exposes bare topsoil, which contributes to wind and water erosion, which removes more native grass because now you're getting rid of the soil, which exposes more bare topsoil, and that becomes a runaway loop, what we call a positive feedback. It can also compact soil and damage the structure. That means you have less water infiltration because water can't sink into soil that's been compacted as much. It also decreases aeration because you don't have the little tiny channels of oxygen or pores of oxygen going into the soil. And also invasive species can gain a foothold and outcompete natives in the altered environment. And these all have the similar effect of decreasing grass growth and survival. And so it's a big problem when we talk about overgrazing is having reduction of the grasses, because they really are helping to keep the soil fertile and also to keep the soil from eroding away. So you can do some responsible grazing. It can be done sustainably. Responsible ranchers maintain the productivity of their soil and grasses. One thing they do often is prescribed burns, which can help clear out non-natives and return nutrients to the soil, because many non-native plants are not able to tolerate fires, whereas the native grasses are able to. Their roots survive and they can resprout. So deforestation is another problem where careless forestry practices can cause erosion and soil degradation. Here we see a hillside that had clear-cut logging on a steep slope, and this is the primary cause for soil erosion. And so we can see even some effect of the erosion washing onto this road. So what's the alternative? Selective cutting, where this process leaves some mature trees for reseeding the area and slowing water flow. So some of these mature trees that are left will deposit seeds on the ground, which will then become new plants. And also, as water is running down this hillside, it's going to be slowed by the vegetation. And the last topic here is over-irrigation. And this means the artificial provision of water to support agriculture, that's irrigation. And 70% of all fresh water used by humans is used for irrigation. Irrigated land globally covers more area than all of Mexico and Central America combined. And irrigation has boosted productivity in many places, but too much can cause problems. So such problems as waterlogging, where over-irrigation raises the water table so high that it suffocates plant roots. So the roots are just constantly submerged, and they're not getting the oxygen that the microorganisms need on their plant roots and things like that. And another big problem is called salinization, and we're going to do a little lab with this. It's the buildup of salts in surface soil layers, and it's a widespread problem. And it's caused from evaporation in arid areas, which draws water up through the soil, bringing salts with it. And repeated irrigation causes repeated evaporation and more salts. So all water on Earth has some level of salts dissolved in it. And when the water evaporates, it's going to leave some of those salts behind. And you can see this if you've ever done the dishes and you see a dish that has dried and left behind like a milky film. Those were the salts that were dissolved in the water. And these salts can be really damaging to plants and can keep them from being able to sprout and grow. So how do you prevent it? Well, you don't plant crops that need a lot of irrigation, or you irrigate with water that is low in salt content, or you can irrigate efficiently using only as much water as necessary. So some improved irrigation techniques. In conventional irrigation, only 43% of the water reaches plants, and you can see a lot of this water here just going off and evaporating in the air before it even hits the plants. And in drip irrigation, water arrives in drips targeted to plant roots, conserving water, saving money, and reducing problems like salinization. And we saw some examples of that at Fairview Gardens. And I'll mention too that a lot of this water, in addition to evaporating, will just run off into other areas. How do you actually reverse salinization once it's occurred? Well, one thing is you can wait for rain to flush away the salts. You can also try planting salt-tolerant plants. And you can flush the soil with large quantities of less saline water, but this can lead to waterlogging. So that's the conclusion of many of the topics on assignment 5.3. So let's ask in class if you have any questions that you want to go over.